Café De Beurs is a very important venue to understand the significance of socialism, not only in the city of Groningen, but in the wider context of the region. Now, in order to understand why this place is so important, we need to take a step back and look at the late 19th century and what was happening socially and economically in the region. And in the region of Groningen, there was the emergence of a very influential and robust agricultural economy with very rich land-owning farmers who produced wheat and grain. And these agricultural products resulted in an industry, particularly in the city of Groningen, where all these products were made into commodities. The social, cultural, and economic difference between these rich farmers, the land workers, and the industrial workers in the city was enormous. So the rich industrialists and the poor workers, that really incited socialist agitators to come to Groningen and mobilize the working class from the late 19th century onwards. In 1885, in Café De Beurs, for the first time in Groningen, a political movement was established called the Sociaal-Democratische Bond, the Social Democratic Bond. And that happened exactly in this cafe. So that is why it is such an important place, because it sealed off a process that was ongoing or had been ongoing for about 3-4 decades and marked a new starting point for the history of socialist politics in the city and the region. The rise of socialism in the Netherlands in general was prompted by foreign agitators, political activists, particularly from Belgium, France, and Germany, who first came to Amsterdam to discuss with Dutch counterparts how socialism was best mobilized and institutionalized. And gradually from Amsterdam, as the Dutch hub of socialism, this spread out to the countryside and also resulted in sustainable contacts between socialists in Groningen, in Germany, in Amsterdam, and in Belgium. So there was a transnational movement behind the rise of early socialism in the late 19th century. One could argue that in the late 19th century, there still wasn't democracy as we know it today. So there was no universal suffrage. So most people from the working class were not eligible to vote. But these labor movements, these political movements, as they emerged and were established in the course of the 19th century, were important to strive for universal suffrage. And ultimately, the socialist movement basically bifurcated in two directions. On the one hand, you had the so-called anti-parliamentary communist movement, which was in favor of revolution and overthrowing the democratic order. On the other hand, you had the social democratic movement, which was also very influential, which saw parliamentary means as the best way to improve the living conditions of the working class. As universal franchise increased or was established in the Netherlands, these social democratic parties were very influential, particularly at the local level, at creating amenities, services, and facilities for the poorer communities in the city. So they established sewerage, running water, public transport, better social housing. So in that respect, in the longer run, particularly in the 1920s and 1930s, these local socialist administrators were very important for improving the working and living conditions of the working class in Groningen. Originally, the rich families, whether they're being farmers or industrialists in the province of Groningen, were rather liberal, strangely enough. So there is also a tradition of progressive liberalism in Groningen that was mostly carried out by these rich industrialists and farmers. So in a sense, there was some kind of sympathy towards the emancipation of the poorer classes. However, the socialist agenda, which was about doing away with individual ownership altogether, was obviously not in their interest, because their wealth and their riches was built on individual property. So there was this strange paradox. On the one hand, many of these rich farmers and industrialists felt sympathetic towards the socialist movement. On the other hand, their own wealth also depended on the exploitation of the working class. So also within these richer communities, you see a rift between those moving more towards protecting their own interests, towards those who became even more sympathetic to the socialist movement. Now, so I would say there are two cleavages. One is between these rich communities, as I just explained. Another one is that they were not very sympathetic towards the more radical elements of socialism. That is, in the case of Groningen, the communist movement, who wanted a revolution and wanted to overthrow the system. So between the rich landowners and these communist constituencies, there was a lot of tension. Even so much that in 1929, the biggest agricultural strike in the history of the Netherlands emerged when communist union leaders convinced the workers to stop working for better wages and living conditions, obviously at the expense of the rich land-owning farmers, who were liberal, but not that liberal. They were not communists. So there have been many cleavages in the course of the early 20th century between these two groups, but at the same time, they were not enemies per se. There was an overarching, progressive, forward-looking attitude among both the workers as well as the rich farmers. Café De Beurs, situated at the corner of the Vismarkt, was one of the very few venues, cafes, that was sympathetic to receiving socialist agitators or movements. Now you have to keep in mind that not all cafes or public venues were willing to receive socialist agitators, which among many people in the city did not have a good reputation. Now, next to the cafe on the Vismarkt is the Korenbeurs, in which now is one of the Albert Heijn supermarkets. The Korenbeurs was the place where the rich farmers sold their wheat, their grain, to traders. So, in a sense, within the span of a couple of square meters, you will find two hotbeds of political agitation. On the one hand, we see Café De Beurs, which is the starting point of the socialist political movement in the city. On the other hand, we have the Korenbeurs, where these rich farmers and industrialists gathered and also had their own economic and political agenda. Now, the irony is, if we fast forward to the 1970s and the 1980s, the Korenbeurs was the place where the so-called Volkscongressen were organized, the people's conferences. And you have to take in mind that by the 1970s, in the city of Groningen and in its vicinity, there was an enormous unemployment. The industries that were established in the 19th century all closed down. People of Groningen felt exploited by the central government. And there was this very important communist leader called Fré Meis, one of the most significant political leaders in the history of Groningen, who organized with the Communist Party, with trade unions, and with other voluntary associations and interest groups, these Volkscongressen, these people's conferences, in the Korenbeurs. And there are these wonderful pictures where you see thousands of people in the building supporting the master action frame of "we are being exploited, we deserve better." And this coincided with unemployment, with plans of the government to create a nuclear waste dump in Groningen. It coincided with all kinds of projects in which the people of Groningen had no say into. So if you want a history of 100 years of socialism in Groningen, the Vismarkt, while looking at the Huizen De Beurs, Café De Beurs, and while looking at the Korenbeurs, really sums it up nicely. So this is a story about socialism in Groningen, and in order to understand socialism in its own right, you also have to acknowledge the other ideological orientations that were also present in the city. Maybe you've heard of the phenomenon of verzuiling in the Netherlands, in English, pillarization. This is a metaphor that has been used in scholarship to refer to the way in which Dutch society was organized from the late 19th century onwards up until the 1970s. And this concept means that even in a city like Groningen, but also elsewhere in the country, you had a variety of ideological communities living next to each other. So usually those were socialists, liberals, Orthodox Protestants, more progressive Protestants, and Catholics. Now, each of these groups all had their own institutions, their own cafes, their own newspapers, their own voluntary associations, their own football clubs even, their own bakeries. So in that sense, all these various different ideological communities were living together, but apart. If it comes to looking into the interactions between these groups, it were usually the elites of these various compartmentalized communities that spoke with one another to make sure that things were in order at the aggregate level. But if you look at society in the early 20th century in Groningen or in the Groningen countryside, you will find many examples of how Protestant, Catholic, Socialist and liberal communities were living separate lives. They were at the day-to-day level hardly interacting with one another, maybe only on the work floor because they were working in the same factory or for the same farmer. So when you think about interactions and interconnections between ideological and religious communities in the Netherlands, you have to keep in mind this very particular way of organizing society in the Netherlands, pillarization. Groningen still is and always has been one of the most left-wing regions, cities, provinces in the Netherlands. And if we think in terms of how the legacy of 19th century socialism is still visible today, I think you only have to look at the election results for local, regional and national and even European elections to see that the percentage of votes that goes to the Labour Party, to the Green Party, to the Socialist Party is higher than elsewhere in the country. If you really want to look for a very specific legacy in Groningen, Groningen has been the only province, the only region in the Netherlands where a communist mayor has been appointed in the 70s, where there was a provincial executive that included a communist politician, where the Communist Party still is present in some of the municipal councils in the countryside. So in that respect, socialism, as it emerged in the 19th century, is still very much present in daily politics in the region and the city, is still very much at the heart of the political identity of Groningen. If we go back to Café De Beurs and the foundation of the Sociaal-Democratische Bond, this first political movement that was created, and we think about their ideals, their goals, their aims, which was mostly about getting franchise, improving living and working conditions, higher wages. If we take those into account and see what remains of them, we still see contemporary versions equivalents to those aims and goals, although these goals always have their own historical context. So today, these more socialist-oriented goals are about solving poverty in the rural regions of Groningen, helping the people who were suffering from the earthquakes that have happened due to gas extraction, making sure that illiteracy, which is a problem among rural communities in Groningen, is being tackled. So in that sense, there is still a rich socialist progressive platform that articulates and mobilizes these interests, which are for the improvement of working conditions of the lower classes in the region. Now, to put this story in a more European or transnational perspective. Now, there's one thing that clearly comes to the fore when thinking about the development of socialism in Groningen. That Groningen was definitely not the only city in the Netherlands, not in Europe, not in Western Europe, and that there were many personal networks involved in initiating these socialist movements and making it more robust also across borders. Now, particularly this communist branch that established itself in Groningen, even during the Cold War, had a lot of ties and connections with communist Russia, with the Soviet Union, but also with other communist countries in the Eastern Bloc of Europe. One of these local leaders, like Frey Meis, who I mentioned earlier, traveled to Moscow to make sure that the friendship ties were made robust and sustainable, and also to make sure that they had the support of the communist countries in the eastern part of Europe during the Cold War. If we go back further into history, into the 19th century, and I started off with that, we see that we had a lot of socialist agitators who roamed and traveled the European continent to spread the gospel of socialism. And many of these political activists also ended up in Groningen at one point to inspire the local leadership of the socialist movement, to make sure that they read the right propaganda, and also to make sure that a transnational network emerged out of socialism, which we today know as the Socialist International, which was a primarily European movement in which socialist leaders, politicians, and activists met one another, organized conferences, and exchanged experiences and materials. So, if you're standing on the Vismarkt and you look to Café De Beurs on the left and to the Korenbeurs, the Albertheijn on the right, please keep in mind that you're looking at socialist history in the city that spans almost more than a century and has been really important for the people and the city of Groningen.